This is with respect to the policing. You were saying that they're 4% of the population and yet 20%. And over time, a lot of intervention in terms of training and educating the justice system, but not with a lot of success. Can you say what are some of the barriers that are impeding any sort of substantial improvement in that area?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think if I could name just one thing that I think is really impeding us crossing over to that next level of understanding, it's really putting together the pieces of how the experience of colonialism is not a pan experience. It's not a one-size-fits-all experience. This is a perfect example that I can give you, is that when we think of how colonialism has affected Indigenous people, many people think about poverty, they think about living on the reserve, they think about overcrowded housing, they think about residential schools, but there's more to that, and there's a legacy that has branched off of that, and different families have experienced colonial trauma in different ways. So one of the ways that I think it's really important that people are starting to realize is that the impact that the 60 Scoop has had on many families, as well as the impact of the child welfare system right now. So one of those, and this is really interesting, one of the ways that we were able to make a difference was there was a case that came up through the Court of Appeal in Ontario called R versus Greco, and it was decided about two to 3 years ago now, and it was a young male Indigenous offender who had been taken from his mother. She was 16 when she had him, and the child welfare system essentially bartered with her and said that they weren't going to assist her with assistance and monetary wise for other children unless she signed an agreement that she was going to put them into care. It happened in the 1970s. She did, and ultimately her son got really sick when he was 2 years old. She did put him into care, and he grew up and was adopted fully by a non-Indigenous white family. He learned when he was a teenager that he was Indigenous, and you can see his criminal record just completely go, his whole life went completely downhill after that, and suffered with a lot of identity problems and really struggled in terms of wanting to meet his mother and that kind of thing. When he was sentenced in front of the judge, he was going to go to the penitentiary. There was no doubt about it. It was involved a gun going off in a parking lot in like Ajax or Pickering. And so there was no doubt that this was going to be a federal sentence, but the issue was how was Gladue going to apply? And mind you, this was 2 to 3 years ago. And even at that point in time, the judge essentially, when you listen to his reasons, essentially mocked him and said, the fact that you have taken up this pseudo gang banger identity does not connect you in any way from the fact that you had the privilege of growing up in a non-Indigenous family. So you can imagine how upsetting this is, knowing and understanding what the impact of the 60 Scoop had on his life and his identity, and the judge not being able to make those connections of how that's an aspect of colonialism, and not understanding that there are many different ways in which families have experienced that. And so that's what I would have to say is one of those biggest barriers, is for people who are in those positions of authority really expanding and opening their minds to the fact that this history, it comes in many different ways, shapes, and forms, and all of it needs to be understood in order to really be able to see the offender in front of you properly.
Question about visual identification. When you look the part, obviously you have a very diverse community, but when you look the part, I can't hide that I'm what I am. So, if I get stopped by the police because of my visual identification, when you have that diversity in your community where some people could pass and they're not going to experience the same trauma, the visual trauma that, when they're getting identified, call names or different things because they look the part. So you have a separation from a group of people that say, well, I get targeted all the time, and someone who doesn't look the part, it's just like me. how do they deal with some of that issue?
We go on with ALS, we go with self-identification, and I think that self-identification is a really, it's a really big, important concept that I think is missing or has been missing in a lot of agencies, you know, within the last few decades. But I think that more and more people are coming around in terms of understanding that, like you're saying, identification is not a one-size-fits-all. How we see identification as is when we're asked to do something like work with a client or work with like to write a GLADU report or etc. We look beyond that individual who is self-identified to see what connections they have either in the community. We talk to their parents, their grandparents, their aunts, their uncles to see what kind of connections we can identify through their family. They will have a history with many of them who don't have connections with their immediate family will have a child welfare history that we can utilize, but there must be some way that we can find that connection between who they are and their connection to the Indigenous community. Having said that, there have been instances where we have not said that we couldn't write a report because the person wasn't Indigenous, but we declined to write the report because we could not find a connection that would link them to being an Indigenous person and a community that we felt that we could write the report with any real sense of what it's supposed to be, which is, if we can't find the linkage between yourself and being an Indigenous person, then we can't write about how that indigeneity has affected you throughout your childhood or throughout your young adulthood or whatever. So we've declined to write reports based on that reason, but never because we've determined that you're not Indigenous. Yeah, exactly. It's just about making those connections. But also, I think the reverse is also true of what you're saying, is that our communities do look very diverse, and it's not always at face value in terms of whether or not a person looks Indigenous. But having said that, there's also a lot of reverse racism that goes on within communities too that needs to be acknowledged, in terms of a person can very well suffer a lot of identity issues and have a lot of trauma that comes from looking non-native but growing up in an Indigenous community, or looking black but growing up and feeling that connection to your Indigenous community but also not being welcomed by it, or feeling not accepted as a result. So I think there's a lot of that also, and I think it's really important to say that a lot of that comes from the Indian Act, and a lot of that comes from the federal government feeling that they're entitled to determine who is status, who is not status, who's an Indian and who's not. And that is, I'm not going to swear, but that is one of the biggest pieces of, and it needs to be recognized that part has done more damage to our communities in terms of us being able to accept our own people, because we don't have the ability to control who we recognize as being Indigenous. And so those are, I think, barriers that we are overcoming, that we are starting to recognize that we're not going to accept what the federal government is telling us in terms of who our own people are. But like I said, that's been a process for the last few decades. And so I hope that we get there, because we can't do it fast enough, for sure.
If I might just add to that, from a perspective of health and wellness, when we work with people, our work is about trying to connect their hearts and their minds together so that they are empowered to speak in their authentic voice of being a human being, being exactly who they are. We work very hard to connect them with elders so they can have those medicine talks, so their full heart can be expressed, so that they can become grounded people, and that they can separate trauma from who they are in their authenticity. Bringing in that traditional knowledge, connecting them to their spirit name, connecting them to ceremony, and then as they grow, develop, and stabilize, information comes forward about who they really are and who their people are, and bringing in knowledge keepers and elders specific to their territories increases their knowledge. So there is something tremendous to be said for all human beings, that when we understand who we are in the context of our ancestors, then that's our authenticity of being, not the performative, what society demands of us to perform, not our job titles, not our academia, but our true authentic self. That is how, from the lens that I come from, that is true health and wellness. Which I hope that's helpful.
I just want to ask a question around what you mentioned about Black Indigenous. I only found out a couple of years ago that I actually have Indigenous on my mom's side of the family from the Mid-Town. And so I started to do a little bit more research. And thinking back, pretty much of my history is around Black history. And so what I found out was that during the time of slavery and after when the slaves were freed and came to Canada, a lot of the Black free slaves were used to help kill off the loss of buffalo. And so it caused tension between the native people of North America and the Black community. And so there was that tension there. And I never even knew about that history, so that was very interesting. So my question is, we have very similarities as far as oppression and the impact of colonialism on our heritage, our language, our names, our laws, within the policing system, the educational system, the healthcare system, the whole gamut. Has it ever been where the two communities can come together and even lobby together to strengthen the voice of the impact of colonialism on both communities, to lobby and pool our resources, pool our knowledge to address the systemic racism that the Indigenous community experiences as well as the Black community?
I'll start with education. An equity secretariat was established, I think 2-3 years ago, and I work really closely with the people in there, and a lot of our initiatives as we're moving forward, we're finding what's necessary for some is good for all, and definitely we're looking at a lot of parallel work that we're integrating in terms of gathering data around racialized students, particularly with expulsion and rates of discrimination. We also have just recently began to hire positions in different regions where if someone feels they've been discriminated against, feel comfortable going to a board of education, that there is a human rights advisor. So we're taking a human rights approach. And I think that the systemic causes of most of these things resonate with any marginalized, racialized population where oppression has been a significant part of their history as well as their current state. So we're definitely seeing small steps of looking at that through the lens and informing each other and actually strengthening each other. And when I went on a tour last year, we brought together the people who have dedicated positions for Indigenous education in the boards and the dedicated positions for equity. They're called equity leads and Indigenous leads. And in some boards, they're the same person. And people thought that was great. And those boards got all letters saying, no, you need to hire two, because there's a lot of work to be done. And that's great that you have a person that can do both, but we want two and we want them to work together and we want to build it out from there. And I think kids need to see that. They need to see themselves reflected in their environment. They need to see that diversity. But then we also need to hear the stories and understand that I think it's a little more prevalent than most people like to talk about.
I want to leave the audience thinking that we don't work closely together, because I think that would be a falsehood. There's a difference between working together jointly on projects versus being allies. And I think that that's an important distinction to make. Because I know for a fact that when we do things like our annual strawberry ceremony for missing and murdered Indigenous women, the Black community is always there. supporting us. I know that when there have been protests outside of Toronto Police Headquarters, that our drummers, that where Black Lives Matter has gone to occupy a space, that our drummers have gone to drum all night with them, and to bring that feather to them, and to be there in solidarity as allies. And so I don't think that you need to necessarily always be on the same mission in order to enjoy the fact that you always have an ally who's still on the same path, who's just beside you. And I think that that's really where you need to understand that Indigenous people and Black people have very distinct histories. There are similarities, but when you take away the Indian Act, when you strip out all of that racist legislation, what you're left with is treaties. And treaties were signed from nation to nation. And that is the relationship that Indigenous people are built on, is a nation-to-nation relationship with this government, and that puts us in a unique place. And our colonial history puts us in a unique place. And so I think that it's a beautiful relationship that these two different communities have, and that is enjoyed by other communities as well, but they need to be recognized for what they are, which is, I believe, most accurately described as allies.